I'm Abbie, and I've lived in Cornwall for about 5 years now. Or it would have been 5 years in June. So in probably September last year, late August, early September last year, I was living with my then partner. We separated and had been in the property for about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years. It had converted from a fixed term tenancy onto a monthly rolling assured short hold tenancy. So it was like a really standard tenancy agreement. I decided to move out. So I handed in my notice essentially onto this tenancy, which was a 1-month notice period. Went to view some properties with the same estate agents who are currently managing the tenancy I was in. So they were aware of like the full situation. They knew that I was living with my partner and that I was looking for somewhere on my own, and kind of also were like, the guy himself was quite a friendly conversational guy. So like we chatted quite a lot. He kind of understood like the bits and nuts and bolts of what was going on. We had a dog, so that's like the landlord had agreed for us to have a dog and a cat in the property. It was like quite a chilled out tenancy, and our landlord was our next door neighbour. So on the surface of it, it seemed like it'd be a really friendly, easy transition. I'd move out, my ex would get someone to move into the spare room, everyone would be happy. So I was kind of going through the motions of looking at properties. At the time, hadn't really been fully transparent with my ex about that yet, because essentially I wanted to get something in place before we had that conversation, because obviously the atmosphere in the property is going to change quite a lot once you reveal that kind of information. So went to see a property, put in an offer, actually paid a holding deposit, put in my forms for referencing, at which point got a call from the estate agents who managed both the property I was currently in and the one I'm in now, saying that, oh, actually, unless both of us moved out at the same time, we would both have to remain in the property, and that the landlord had decided that they only wanted a couple to live in that property. They didn't want house sharers, which seemed like a fairly arbitrary decision based on their idea of what they wanted their house to have someone living in, but rather than like valuing the experience of the people currently living there, who during the pandemic, and I know this is beside the point, but during the pandemic, we looked after, he's an elderly man and lives on his own. We kind of had like been looking after him a bit, been helping him out with groceries and that kind of stuff. So at that point I went back to the estate agents and said, okay, you're going to need to give me a bit of time to like deal with it though. I'm going to have to speak to my ex and kind of like work out what I'm going to do. In the meantime, while I was at work, because I was working at that point, they contacted my ex and told them all of this. So essentially said, so your partner's handed in a notice, that means you've got 3 weeks left to vacate the property. What do you want to do about it? So I got home from work to like this situation of like going from, yeah, obviously we'd separated, but things were fairly amicable and we were kind of managing living together in a pandemic, which probably I'm sure lots of people can relate to isn't the easiest thing in the world. To them having found out behind my back that I was trying to move out of the property and trying to leave the situation, which obviously for me was uncomfortable, but can be a really dangerous thing to do and can be a really kind of high risk move, especially because I'd actually requested confidentiality from the estate agents at that point. I was in the spare room. We were both still living in the property together. Essentially, they held me hostage so they wouldn't let me end the tenancy. They refused to even re-reference Ollie, who's my ex, with another tenant, because they'd just made this decision that they didn't want 2 house sharers living there. They only wanted a couple living there. And they refused to give me a reference on any other property, even though I'd agreed, like, okay, well, I'll continue paying rent at this property, but the priority for like my well-being and my partner's well-being is for me to get out of this house. So I'll pay rent on 2 for a couple of months while this all blows over. But they held my reference back, so they wouldn't let me move out essentially, and I was kind of stuck there. Luckily, I have friends in Falmouth. I did eventually, after a couple of months, find a sofa to sleep on. So I wasn't in that property anymore. But that took, I think we separated at the end of August, and it wasn't until the 15th of October that I actually got out of the house. And at that point, it still hadn't been resolved, I don't think. So I was still on the tenancy I couldn't find myself a new tenancy. So I was in a bit of a like between a rock and a hard place of either you rely on the goodwill of friends and family, which not everybody has, or you stay in a really shitty situation, which for me wasn't as bad as it could be, but obviously isn't ideal. So I've always rented. I've always been in like fairly insecure accommodation. So, and I think for like a lot of our generation, like that's just fairly normal. But I just, yeah, you're kind of faced with like that realization that, so if this friend didn't happen to have a sofa, yeah, I would either be stuck in that house in an increasingly sour environment that wasn't like, I was working from home, obviously, because it was a pandemic, and I was confined to the spare room for 2 months, and I couldn't like, you know, I'd go down and cook food when I knew that the house was empty, but I was in quite a like, in like a bit of a rut with that. Wasn't able to go into the office, obviously, because of coronavirus restrictions, wasn't able to like go and work from a coffee shop, which maybe would be what you would do in that situation if you just needed to get some space. And at that point, I don't think you were allowed to, I don't think you were allowed in other people's houses at all, maybe. I can't really remember the timeline of it. But yeah, it was a really like unbelievably isolating and kind of like, it just felt like a bad dream as well, because I'd be calling the estate agents saying like, because, you know, I'm quite, like I'd read up on my rights and knew that what they were doing was wrong. So I was calling them and saying, what you're doing is wrong. And they were just repeating the same sentence to me over and over again, and then like hanging up the phone, and it would just be like a nightmare. Like, great, so now what do I do? And then obviously having, from my ex's perspective as well, like we were going through a separation, which is a difficult time for anybody. He'd found out of the blue from like a random estate agent that I was moving out and that we were maybe going to have to get rid of the dog and get rid of the house, and like everything was really precarious. And then we were still living together, so that was like quite a bit of a storm. So I'd heard that there had recently been a local branch of the community and renters union Acorn started in the area by someone that I knew from just Falmouth's quite a small town, you know people, don't you? So I got in touch and was like, well, I got in touch and just kind of asked like what I could do. How can I get myself out of this situation? I sort of to a degree knew that I definitely had rights and could do something about it, but I didn't really understand like the process of going through that. They make you feel completely powerless and they want you to. Yeah, and I've been a member of workplace union for quite a lot of years, but never really, I guess I wasn't really aware of community unions and the renters unions and the fact that that existed outside of like an employment capacity. Yeah, so I got in touch with Acorn, had a coffee and a chat about my situation, and what kind of the next steps were. So I joined the union, and then we had a meeting with the members of the union, I guess, which at that point it was a really new branch, so there were probably only about 6 to 8 people involved. And we just had a meeting about member defence cases and what the next steps were and how we would get me out of that situation, essentially. And they, yeah, because it was quite new, I think it was like the first member defence case the local branch had had. So we were all learning. We had a training from one of the like regional reps, who obviously was all via Zoom because we were still in like the throes of the pandemic, which was a bit more challenging. But yeah, so we had some training and went through the processes of how you kind of go through the member defence cases, and also just like general ideology around like that direct action kind of stuff, because I think a lot of people were new to it. Yeah, so I think what we did first, so we set out a plan of like all these actions we'd go through, and the first one was to write a letter, and then the second one was to do like phone jamming, and then an in-person action. And so we'd planned out the whole campaign, but actually in the end what happened was, as soon as the estate agents received a letter on Acorn letterhead that was official looking and not just an email from me, they immediately relented and gave in to all of the demands that we'd set out. So I think the demands were that I was released from the contract, and that they would provide a reference on a new property, and that because I'd been paying rent on the property and not been able to live there for 3 months or something, 2 or 3 months, and that I'd have one of those rent payments refunded so that I'd be able to put a deposit down on a new property, and I'd have my deposit returned because the tenancy had been taken out in mine and my ex's name. There was some like back and forth about they couldn't refund my deposit until a new person moved in. But obviously, similarly with withholding the reference, like I was on a low income, I was working fairly in a fairly insecure setting, and I don't have any savings or anything because I've always done that. Like I've never had a high pay salary job. So paying a deposit on a new property when I'd been paying double rent, I think at one point I'd put down a deposit on a property that then had fallen through because I couldn't get a reference and I hadn't been able to get that back. And they were withholding my deposit on the previous property. So I was just in like, as well as this kind of bureaucratic bind they'd got me in, I was also completely financially like stagnant and I couldn't do anything. I wouldn't have been able to get a property even if they'd given me a reference at that point. So one of the requests was that they released my deposit and refunded a month of rent, I think, maybe a bit more. Yeah. Within a couple of days, I think they tried to contact me and speak to me, and I put them in touch with the union rep because obviously at that point, that was where the kind of power was held and the sway was held. I had a historic kind of relationship with the people at the estate agents, and they kind of had like a bit of, well, it's a power dynamic, isn't it? They're in a position of power. They're at whim able to make me homeless. So they went through the rep, and within, I think, a week, it was agreed that they'd meet all our demands, and they paid me the compensation. I think the one thing that didn't happen, or that they didn't meet, because there was a more general demand around like confidentiality, because obviously alongside all the financial and referencing stuff, they'd quite seriously breached my confidentiality, which I'd raised with them. If my situation had been different, this wasn't the situation I was in, but if my situation had been in any way at risk to my like physical, mental well-being or financial, if I was suffering financial or physical abuse in that situation, they could have put me in an extremely dangerous position. So that was another thing that I'd raised with them, that they needed to address their policy or train their staff and make sure that they like weren't putting people in that scenario, particularly because it was in the kind of very sort of almost the worst point of the pandemic, I think, like where we were in a lockdown, and we were seeing so much coverage, and like obviously that makes it seem really anonymous and really like statistical, but about the rise in domestic violent cases, the rise in calls to the police, the rise in people kind of facing homelessness because they didn't have any other choice. So within that wider social context, they were actively putting people at risk and should probably have been more conscientious about that, which I think they addressed and paid lip service to, but probably didn't do any kind of policy work to make sure that that was changed. There are like multifaceted ways you could approach it, and there are some really obvious things that have been really successful in other places. So for instance, in St Ives, there's a local council, I don't know if it's legislation, sorry if I'm getting it wrong, but there is a cap on how many second homes there can be within the area. And once that cap's reached, you can no longer sell properties buy to let, which are then left empty for 6 to 8 months of the year when there are people living in like abject poverty and not able to find somewhere to live. So that's a really obvious thing that you can do in other towns that face that crisis. For like obviously Falmouth, which is where I live, there is a massive amount of second homes, a massive amount of people being turfed out, because this year obviously like we've had much more domestic tourism than international for like obvious reasons. But people who were renting their houses out on a long-term kind of tenancy capacity have converted that to Airbnb or holiday let because it's more of a money spinner. And that's just obviously like deeply immoral because there's been a massive spate of evictions. During the pandemic, there obviously was an extension on Section 21 eviction notices, which has now been lifted. So it's returned to the initial 3-month period. So people are given 3 months to get out of their house and find somewhere else to live. And alongside that, houses are being sold off to people who don't live in Cornwall to have a second home or a second income. And essentially families and local people are being driven out of Cornwall because there's nowhere for them to live. So I think a really obvious way to tackle that is to put a cap on how many second homes there are, or how many kind of sales go through as buy to let. Yeah, and I guess that's in terms of like a buying point of view. Also for me, like one of the most feasible and kind of tangibly within reach solutions to the housing crisis is like direct action. So people are made to feel completely powerless. And the one thing that we do have is power in community and people power and the ability to get together and make a difference that doesn't rely on waiting for bureaucracy to be pushed through, waiting for legislation for change, waiting for your landlord to reply to an email that you sent a month ago, waiting for the bailiffs to come. You have like the power that's like within your reach is what you can do yourself. And we've reached a point now where essentially we're in a state of desperation. People are being pushed out of their homes who've lived in them for 50 years. Single parents with 4 kids are being made homeless because the landlord can make double rent if they rent it to 6 students. You have a situation where people are being pushed onto the streets, pushed out of Cornwall and left with nowhere to go, sometimes towards the end of their lives, sometimes with children who are at the beginning of their lives and they're being given the most unfair start to life possible. But you can actually resist that, and like you have a legal right to resist that, but you also have a moral right to resist that. You can stage eviction resistances and put a genuine barrier of people between bailiffs and kicking a single dad with 4 kids out onto the street. You can occupy empty properties. I mean, what is the absolute, like what is happening when there are people sleeping in doorways and massive empty buildings 4 doors down that have been empty for 6 years because the council can't make a profit on it, or the private landlord can't make enough of a profit on it for it to be worth it? Those spaces are there for us to occupy. And I mean, obviously there's a lot of nuance to property ownership and we probably won't get into that, but essentially you have the power to take what you need, whether that's to stay in your own house, whether that's to fight your landlord, whether that's to like find a space that's comfortable for you to have a roof over your head at the cost of 6 empty buildings on one high street, 7 empty houses in one housing estate that are sitting there waiting for some kind of way that they can contribute to capitalism. And in the meantime, people are being pushed out onto the streets and like, probably sounds really dramatic, but people are dying. Like you don't have a choice anymore. And I think we are kind of we're conditioned from like the way we're brought up to think that you have to pursue things through the means that are offered to you. And that can sometimes be a 42-page document with 7,000 little boxes that you have to fill in that you're never going to be able to get to the council office because you literally don't have the means or the tools to follow their routes. And it's made that way. It's designed to prevent you from being able to kind of fight for the rights that you have. So I just think we've reached a point now where people are desperate. We're in like a genuinely critical situation. And what have we got? We've got each other. And you actually have a willing and available group of unbelievably empathetic, moral community members who are waiting to help you out. And I think that's what we need to do. And that's where we need to look. We kind of need to look within our local communities, focus on mutual aid, and focus on fairly radical direct action as the only way to resist a system that will ruthlessly push us to the point of breaking point unless we kind of stand up to them. So yeah, I think that's what you need to do. I'm housed at the moment. I have a room in a shared house. It's a 3-bed flat and I've got a room that I pay a fairly low amount of rent for. I'm in insecure work. I work part-time and I work freelance the other bit of the time. So that's like not a very stable situation to be in. But again, I work in charities and fundraising and there's not a lot of work in Cornwall. So that's like a bit of another side of the coin. I don't have a contract in the property that I'm in at the moment because essentially in October last year, I was faced with homelessness. A room came up in the house that I happened to be crashing on the sofa of, and I took it with it. Like I didn't really have a choice. I'd been looking at other properties. I have a dog, so finding a property where I'm allowed to keep a dog is also really challenging and increasingly challenging because landlords and estate agents kind of apply pressure for contracts to exclude pets because it just suits them better and they face less financial risk at kind of like cost of, I don't know, defleeing carpets or whatever. And yeah, so I didn't really have a choice. I took this room. It's not ideal because no, I don't have a tenancy agreement. I know that that actually benefits me slightly if they're trying to evict me, but it also leaves me in an unbelievably insecure situation. The other day I came home from work and the ceiling had fallen down in the kitchen. So I had to clear that up myself, put it all in like those big blue IKEA bags and called my landlord. He came around and vacuumed. That was 3 weeks ago and I haven't heard from them since. So we just don't have a ceiling. So, you know, it's not great. And also it's within my current like financial scope to stay there where I'm staying. Actually, no, I don't mind saying. So I'm paying £450 a month and that includes bills and council tax. That's about as much as I can afford because I'm not working full time and I'm struggling to find freelance work at the moment. If I had to leave that property, put down a deposit on a new place, and since October when I was last looking for houses, the 1-bed properties or spare rooms have almost doubled in the amount that landlords and estate agents are asking for. So it would have been a stretch then, but I could afford it. And at that point I was in full-time permanent work. It's genuinely not a possibility now. Yeah, so one of the things I considered when I was in kind of crisis mode was moving back up. I'm from Yorkshire originally, moving back up and living in my mum's annex. And I think that's kind of my only option at the moment. It took me 3 months to find a room last year. And this year it's immeasurably worse. I think someone said earlier that they just recently looked on Rightmove and there were 3 properties available in Falmouth. It's like, yeah, impossible. And also we're currently, the middle of September, so the new students are all moving down. So we're currently being like met with an influx of new residents in Falmouth and Penryn, which like obviously is, you know, the university is a big part of like the economy and whatever in Falmouth, but if they're not meeting that housing demand, where are those people going to go? And also, who is that going to impact? Because it's not going to impact the students, because landlords can make a nice bit of money off renting out a 6-bed house for a ludicrous amount of money per room. But the family that happen to be living in that 6-bed house, who've got 5 kids and a dog and 3 cats, aren't going to be able to find somewhere else to go when they get kicked out within the county. So it's going to see like a bit of a mass exodus out of Cornwall, I think, of Cornish people, and of the kind of that bit of a grey area between like not quite, I don't know, like, I guess young professionals, but not quite secure, not quite like able to pay a mortgage, not quite cleared your overdraft from when you were at university 12 years ago, not quite like made it in terms of like finding that security that is sort of always just seems to be a little bit out of your reach. And this year has just made it like, it's not a little bit, it's just, all right, never mind then. I guess I'll always just live under this slight question mark of, uncertainty.